With Ursula's return just around the corner, it looks to be a set that's going to shake up the metagame once again, as expected, but there are two different ways that I think you can look at this set. You can look at it as what new decks will become viable because of this set, so I'm thinking things like Amber Emerald Discard might come back as a viable deck, more aggro focused strategies utilizing Emerald. We might see like a Madrigal deck do well because there's a lot of cards focusing around that archetype, and Amber Amethyst might become a deck that's really pushing to become meta as well. So it looks like this set is going to actually introduce some more diversity into the game, which is quite interesting. The purpose of this video though is going to be to look at some of the top cards from each ink combination that complement existing decks in the metagame. So we take a look at some of the top decks like Emerald Steel Discard, Amber Steel Song, Ruby Amethyst, which has fallen off a little bit, but you know, it's still relevant, Sapphire Steel and Sapphire Ruby, so on and so forth. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the Amber color and see what are the top cards to complement existing decks there. So the first card I want to take a look at in Amber is Ariel Singing Mermaid. Well, Amber Steel Song, this is another singer, but when you look at an Amber Steel Song list, all of their songs are 5 cost and below, and I don't really think there's going to be any change to that when we move into Ursula's return, because the deck is pretty optimized. It'll probably adapt a few cards from the set, but this probably wouldn't be one of them. Where you can see this deck potentially being utilized is in an Amber Ruby deck that can utilize it to sing a Be Prepared early on. So Mufasa could potentially play this, because what does Mufasa decks like to do? Well, they like to make sure that all of their characters are high questers or high impact cards. Usually, you know, we've seen success with the 60 card version, and that will probably remain the most successful version. But teching in 4 Be Prepareds to potentially put this down early and just instantly wipe out some aggro threats when you're on the draw with Mufasa, Amber Ruby Mufasa, is potentially very strong, because that deck is very strong on the play, but it does suffer a little bit on the draw. Being able to neutralize tempo and reset a board state, especially against aggro decks with a card like this, dropping on turn 4, singing Be Prepared on turn 5, can be really strong, because as you know, these Ruby decks that play very high on the top end can really utilize their later drops like the Tremaines, Madame Medusas, Maleficent Dragons, and even now Be Prepared if you're taking that in order to just dominate the game from there. I think this card is potentially a sleeper in Amber Ruby Mufasa, but we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. The only other Amber card I want to talk about is Gaston's Despicable Dealer. Now, in my 1 hour review, I kind of wrote this card off because I do think it's a little high risk, but dropping this on turn 3, I thought it was a 4 cost first, to be honest, so the fact that it's a 3 cost is actually really good, because basically when you think about what Amber Ruby Mufasa plays right now, it's Doc in this slot, right? You quest with the Doc, you reduce the cost of a character by 1. So for 3, instead of questing for 2, you can essentially play out a 6 drop like a Madame Medusa on turn 4. That is actually huge. The 6 cost curve is massive, because I think even Hydra costs 6 if I'm not mistaken, and that deck can sometimes play that. But yeah, the Medusa coming down. I don't think there's a 6 rusher that we would play yet in Ruby yet, but you know, if we do get one of those in the future, this card could potentially be one that gets slotted into Mufasa, depending on what the uninkable count looks like. As I was just explaining, if you want to tech in 4 Be Prepared, maybe you don't go this route. Maybe you choose either the Ariel or the Gaston. Does this card see play in Amber Steel Song? Hard to say. I would say probably not, just because if you look at how that deck is constructed, you'd basically have to start cutting back on uninkables, which are basically all your songs, since all the characters they play are inkable, and this would reintroduce uninkable characters into that deck. So I think this would be a hard sell. You know, we've already seen kind of the Lantern version regress a little bit and the Flute version take over, but that was based on the set 3 metagame, with the Flute version having the best potential matchup against Sapphire Ruby. What does set 4 do for Amber Steel Song? I don't think it does too much, but we'll have to wait and see. But these are the 2 cards that I see basically potentially being used in Amber Ruby Mufasa. I don't really see anything super supportive of Amber Steel Song from Amber yet. Let me know in the comment section below if you disagree. But I'm sure we'll see something develop. Now, of course, before I wrap up the Amber section, because yeah, I only have these 2 cards, there are a lot of decent cards in Amber, don't get me wrong, like the new Ursula, that is the Shift Discard. and the new Daisy Duck that on play discards, those could become viable in a reemergence of Amber Emerald discard or something. But I'm not kind of putting those in here just yet because that's a deck that I don't think has really shown up in the metagame at all, really. But it could become a force come Ursula's return. So the next card I want to look at is from Amethyst now, and the Isabella Madrigal could be a card that is really utilized in a couple of different Amethyst builds. The fact that it is a 5-cost inkable card, let alone raises the ceiling for this. In a top deck mode, this card could be in a fantastic top deck, even in a specific kind of setup with like a low to the ground aggro. Probably not, but like maybe even in Emerald Amethyst, right? This card can just be used as a contingency. You drop it, assuming your board gets outed. If you're going up against Steel, which is a tough matchup for Emerald Amethyst, and then this card can just start questing for a bunch. In Ruby Amethyst, you can obviously use this as your main source of questing for 4 lore potentially, which is huge, and then use your other cards to control the board state, challenging and whatnot, and then pair this with locations to gain even more passive lore gain, and then control the board state with challenging, and this is your quester. So there's a lot of different strategies I think you can utilize with this card. The more I look at it, the more I think that this card does have a lot of potential. It might not be played, but I do think it's worth a look, and one of the cards that I think complements existing decks in the format already that could be played in those Amethyst builds as well. So one of the potentially best cards in the whole set, in my opinion, is the new boss monster, Ursula Sea Witch Queen. This 7-cost inkable card can be played in any Amethyst build, in my opinion, that has any sort of top end that's not very low to the ground. So in Emerald Amethyst, for example, the version that at least plays very aggro, you probably don't play this, obviously, but maybe you could, because Shift 5 on top of the Emerald Ursula could still be a thing, keeping you around that Shift 5 curve, and at worst, it is always inkable. So again, these inkable cards just raise the ceiling and the playability of these things by a dramatic amount. A 4/7 body that, I've already talked about this, plays around Medusa, plays around Maui, plays around and then along came Zeus, is huge. Not only that, there's a lot of good shift targets for this. Not that you probably ever want to shift this on an Ursula Deceiver of All, the double singer, but you could if you really needed that like extra little bit of lore. You obviously would ideally want to shift this on the 2-cost Ursula, either the one that comes in this set as basically a Prince Eric clone, a 1/3 Challenger 2 for two, I believe, or the 2-cost Emerald Ursula that we already got into the Inkland set that rips a song from the opponent's hand. This character, whenever she quests, will force an exertion. So yeah, again, probably want to play this in a more challenge-focused deck. So it ideally fits in with Ruby Amethyst very well. And then other characters can exert to sing songs, which does include your own characters, but that's probably a-okay, since all you're really going to probably want to sing in Ruby Amethyst is Friends on the Other Side, and at this point you can probably ink that. I've already talked about inking that card in favor of playing Rabbits and Queen's Castles for alternative draws anyways, but the fact that it quests for 3 on such a big body, it solves the problem that Ursula Power Hungry has. Ironically enough, this card power creeps Ursula Power Hungry in terms of its stats and its body, right? A 4/7, very hard for Steel to deal with. They have to throw multiple things into it. Quest for 3, so it's a threat that has to be answered right away. It's inkable, whereas Power Hungry wasn't. They're both 7 cost. This one is obviously shiftable, and of course, this card doesn't drain lore or draw a card, but it exerts characters and it stops the singing of songs, which gives you a much favorable matchup into Amber Steel Song, which is what Ruby Amethyst has struggled with in the past. So really strong card, probably a meta-defining card on the top end, but whether or not it will actually be meta-defining will depend on if the game has been able to be slowed down enough where these aggro decks aren't really just kind of running everything over. Alright, I'm going to try to do Emerald all in one take here because, like I said in my previous video, I thought Ruby was the clear winner in Ursula's Return, but actually going through a lot of the Emerald cards and seeing how they could potentially fit in with Emerald decks currently, given that Emerald decks really got a big boost from Into the Inklands, there are a lot of cards in Emerald that I think are very viable to be inserted into current Emerald decks, and even Well, I mean, the point of this video isn't to discuss what new decks could potentially come out. Maybe that's for another video. But, what could these help strengthen or reinforce to make previous, like, emerald decks that weren't viable more viable? So to start off, we're going to look at Crikey here, Lucky Cricket, a 3/4 body that quests for 3, and when you play this character, other characters get +3 strength this turn. This card is massive. It's especially massive for something like Ruby, where when you take a look at some of those cards now being so heavily focused on the strength that their characters have, this card can single-handedly make that Snuggly Duckling location, make the Li Shang that gives +1 lore for questing to things that have 4 higher strength, I think it is. Like, there's a lot of potential for this card to just drop and just unexpectedly win you the game just from the fact that it gives you strength. Of course, this is another tempo disrupting card potentially. If your opponent's like, I'm questing for, a lot here, you can't deal with my board, I'm going to quest for game next turn again, and then you drop this character, you buff all of your, weak emerald characters or whatever other color you're using, and then you throw them into your opponent's board and just wipe it out, and now you have total control of the game. So in certain scenarios, this card can act as a very versatile card depending on what you're pairing it with. Like I said, utilizing it with like Li Shang as a combo to boost your strength, with locations to boost the abilities of those locations, with just inherently with emerald to just wipe out boards and then regain control. Like, it can act as like a be prepared as kind of card, or like a Scar kind of card, right, where you're able to wipe out an exerted board with this character beefing up all of your existing characters. So the more I look at that card, the more I'm just like, yeah, I'm gonna get a playset as soon as I can. The next card is Diablo, Devoted Herald. So when I first looked at this card, I kind of wrote it off as saying like it's probably not that great. However, I will admit that was probably wrong. And I'll do a complete 180, because the more I look at this card and the more I think about what its application will be, I really am doing a 180, because with the 1-drop Diablo, you have a little bit of an advantage potentially in getting this out at the same turn as a Bucky, let's say. Drop Bucky on turn 2, shift this by discarding so you don't have to pay any ink, and then you get this out right away. It forces a discard on your opponent's side, so it matches the discard. Then you can quest with it and get the draw when your opponent draws for turn, and any other cards they may draw if they can't out this right away. This card actually, unfortunately, might be akin to Beast Tragic Hero from Rise of the Floodborn. So yeah, quite a 180 on this. When you look at what Beast Tragic Hero does for Steel, it's a 1-card draw engine, and look how aggressively people try to put damage on it. I mean, people will be playing things to specifically out this, and because it's so weak and it doesn't have any kind of additional secondary effect, like, no one really uses the 7/5 beast when it gets the damage, but it is relevant sometimes, and at least you still have some advantage. Whereas if you put 2 damage on this, it's dead, right, compared to Beast, where it's still alive and it's still a threat on the board. And Beast can be healed up in certain decks, right, like with Popsicles and Sapphire Steel. But this card, if your opponent doesn't have the out, if they don't have the damage spell, if they can't deal with the evasive, if they just don't even have a way to interact with an evasive card like this, their deck is just going to lose to this instantly, right? So you're going to see this card, I think, pop up in a lot, if not most, Emerald decks, actually. It is a little bit of a risk, don't get me wrong, but because it's so low cost and it is just a 1-questing evasive at worst, like, yeah, you play it, you lose some tempo if it gets outed right away, but at the very least, it should hopefully replace itself if you can play it and get it exerted, and at least get 1 draw off of it. And if you get 2 or more draws, I would consider that, making your money back, air quotes. And the 1-drop Diablo, as you can see here, isn't necessarily the worst, because you get to see your opponent's hand as well, and then if you can shift it for no ink, that's an advantage. The next card I want to talk about is Jack, and I talked about this with the Lyle a little earlier, where you play this character and then a chosen opposing character gains Reckless is actually very strong. Now, this character is inkable. It's a 3-cost 1/4, and it quests for 2. Whereas the Lyle has the ability that whenever your characters are banished, your opponent loses a lore. But it's a quest for 1, and I think it's a 2/4 body, which is actually still decent for 3, but it's uninkable. So like these kind of cards can be extremely strong, especially in the Emerald Mirrors, which look to be more and more common these days, simply because, giving the opposing Flynn Riders, given the opposing Curse Merfolk, Reckless is like a huge tempo swinging play. So again, if you watch my videos, I talk about this a lot. These cards that can swing tempo for the player who's on the play versus the draw is what we need in this game. And Lyle was really overlooked because, he's uninkable, he's kind of slow, but his ability to slow the game down by draining lore when your characters are banished, his ability to give reckless to something, because we've seen aggro decks take over and we need ways to slow them down. These kind of cards are what we need to do that. This card I think is going to be absolutely fantastic for Emerald. The next card I want to talk about is Pegasus Cloud Racer. So again, I talked about this card and kind of the conditions that would be needed in order for you to kind of get this off. In an ideal scenario, you're shifting this on 3 and you have a couple of 1-drops and one, or not a couple, but like a 1-drop, a 2-drop. Your 1-drop probably going to be the small Pegasus. Your 2-drop, hopefully a big quester like Flynn Rider. You drop this, it has evasive, it gives your Flynn Rider evasive. You quest for 4. So you quest for 1 with Pegasus, you play the Flynn, then you pass back to you, you shift this, and then you quest for 4. So you're at 5, and your Flynn Rider's automatically protected from challenging. Not that I don't know, maybe they would challenge it, but they probably have other forms of removal, right? But even in the later game, this card could be very beneficial because when you have a bit of an established board and your opponent is maybe in top deck mode and they're looking to challenge your Curse Merfolk and your Flynn Riders and stuff, you shifting this right on the Pegasus, giving all your characters evasive and questing, and your opponent has a top deck and answer, right? Because you've discarded their hand probably, and they have no forms of like songs to remove your characters. They have to challenge. The evasive just like locks it up for you, right? Locks up the game. So this card could potentially be a game winner. Again, just more reasons to play Morph because you have to shift this card. I think maybe you start looking at Morph again because playing only that one drop Pegasus may not be enough. That 1-drop Pegasus is very good, and it's the card we're going to look at next here because, Pascal sees play. This card is a better Pascal, and it has an amazing shift target. It's just you want more ways to shift the big Pegasus to get its effect off because it can be that impactful depending on the board state, right? Very strong card. So both of these cards, both of these Pegasus, I think get slotted into any Emerald deck. That's focused on aggro, that is. So I think you can look at this in a low to the ground Emerald Steel deck, and I think you can look at this obviously in Emerald Amethyst, where they really do focus on aggro. This is where this card fits in perfectly. You basically replace Pascals with Pegasus, and then you find room for the big Pegasus. We don't talk about Bruno. Any discard, there's been Emerald Amethyst discard, there's been Emerald Steel discard, and likely to be coming in the future with set 4 is Emerald Amber discard. I'm really not a big fan of seeing all these discard variants, to be honest, because the deck is very annoying to play against. I know because I played it a little bit myself, and it's just a very oppressive deck. But regardless, this card I think is very strong. I've already talked about it. 5-cost inkable. So if it's not going to be too beneficial, you just ink it. But in certain scenarios, this card can really be a game winner for you. Let's say you're up against Ruby Sapphire and they just top deck the Tamatoa, or they scry into the Tamatoa, they drop it. You're able to discard their hand with some stuff, and then you're able to sing this to bounce back that Tamatoa and force them to discard it, right? Because you don't normally have a way to deal with such big threats on Emerald, depending on what you pair it with. I do think Emerald Ruby will become a better deck now, but we'll wait and see. That's again a topic for a different video. But this card, can be a very strategically used card in order to make Emerald viable into the mid to late game, where it would normally just start falling apart against the top end heavy control decks. So I think that we don't talk about Bruno is definitely a card that will make the existing Emerald decks a lot better, the ones that focus on discard at least. So moving on to Ruby, which is what I said I think was the clear winner in this set, because I think it does a lot for the existing decks, but after looking a little bit more into Emerald, I'm maybe thinking Emerald might be the one that comes out the most ahead. But starting off with Ruby, the Flynn Rider that this deck has is a really interesting card that could potentially be used in Ruby Amethyst and even Sapphire Ruby. Probably not Sapphire Ruby, but just hear me out. What do these decks sometimes struggle with, and what do you normally try to tech into these decks in order to beat those bad matchups? It's aggro, right? And what this card does is, if your opponent is focused on those low power, high questing cards, and we've seen Emerald utilize things like Curse Merfolk, a 0/1, Ursula Deceiver in the 2-drop slot, a 1/3, Flynn Rider in the 2-drop slot, a 1/2. Yes, the Emerald Amethyst version can play a Mim Snake and a Mim Fox and start getting that high strength on the board earlier on. The Steel versions can play Mr. Smee at a 3/3. Nothing really in the 4-drop slot, though, I don't think that really Emerald Steel can play. But this card can just help even out that balance a little bit, especially at the start of the game where your opponent is questing with that Cursed Merfolk and those Flynn Riders, and you just drop this, and this card in and of itself beats that curve, right? Because those 1 and 2 drops don't even have enough strength to have, to out this Flynn Rider's ability, basically. So, on your turn 3, right, in a, let's say, Ruby Sapphire deck, if you're able to play this on 2, turn 3, you drop the Fishbone Quill, and then you ink, and then like turn 4, you're able to drop a 5-drop, you drop a Maui, right? And nothing they have is over that. So this card just sits there readied up, and then you have a Maui on board that's challenging their stuff, taking it out, while also gaining you that 3 lore, meaning that you keep pace with their aggro quest. And Ruby Amethyst, yes, it makes the start of the game a little bit more manageable, hopefully, but I don't think it maybe does enough, because again, if your opponent establishes a Mim Snake, the best thing you can do is establish a Mim Snake. The best thing you can do is establish a Mim Fox, a Goat, etc. as you go on in the turns. It's not until turn 5 where you can drop the Maui that you start seeing this card gaining the extra advantage for you. But that extra turn that you get off the Fishbone Quill or the ramp, whatever ramp it might be on the Sapphire side, might be enough to offset the aggro threat from those aggro decks. Against other aggro decks like Amber, Amethyst and stuff, this card can just literally just win you the game or keep pace with those aggro decks enough that they just can't deal with it, which is unfortunate. Aggro decks really do seem to suffer from this card, but this card is huge, I think, for Ruby in some of the meta decks that are looking at more ways to keep pace with some of their tougher matchups. And because this says you have to have a character in play with more strength than each opposing character, it does mean that in the Emerald Amethyst matchup, like if they play a Snake and then you play a Snake, like you don't have a character with more strength. But that's where something like Lumiere can come in. If you drop that Lumiere next and everything you have is +1, I don't think there's anything really in the Emerald Amethyst deck since they cut Yzma that's really high enough strength to get over 5 strength, right? So if your Mim Fox and Snakes now have 4 and 5 strength respectively, or irreversibly or reverse respectively, I don't know which one I said first, but that makes this card like just a card that will instantly keep pace with Emerald Amethyst for you. And then again, once you get to the mid to top end, you should automatically just start winning the game, because that's where those decks start to slow down a little bit, and you'll be able to continually out their cards while keeping pace with their lore. So, this card does a lot for Ruby in some of its struggling matchups. I've talked to much length about this card already, the Goofy Super Goof. Another card that just helps you deal with aggro a lot. Keeping pace with the lore gain and whatnot is very relevant. The rush ability is, really great on this thing. It's inkable. And again, with Lumiere, it's a 3/4, which is just even more insane. It trades with Mim Fox too at worst, so if you're able to play this and challenge something, get the lore, take out a threat, and then they have to Mim Fox it back when you have Lumiere active, it'll trade with Mim Fox. So it goes 2 for 1 and gains you 2 lore, because it has to challenge. But that's really good value, right? So this card does a lot. I think it's an instant slot into Ruby Amethyst. You probably slot this into Ruby Sapphire as well if you are afraid of those aggro decks. So again, just like with what the Robin Hood does for Steel in order to keep pace because of that lore that you gain from banishing characters, this card does the same thing for the Ruby decks that struggled with aggro. And I said this prior to even, I think, any of these cards coming out, when I said, like, we need more ways to slow the game down. We need more anti-aggro stuff, because we've seen this in the metagame with what's being played, with what's winning, with what's topping. And it's very annoying to play against. You can't play any kind of, like, it eliminates a lot of the cards that are on the top end, right? Because everyone's so focused on the low end of the curve, because it's just more effective, because there's just not enough things to deal with it. So I'm glad that they're introducing cards like this, because it's what we need, and it will make these games a little bit more interactive, which is nice, and it'll just continue to increase the skill gap, in my opinion, which is always good in a card game. The next best card for existing decks with what's currently existing in Into the Inklands when Ursula's Return comes out is Mulan. So while this card looks very powerful, and without a doubt it is, I think you just need to be aware that against really good players, they are going to try to play around this. They're going to try to shut down the shift, which is where you really see the value on this card. So just be wary of that. However, you can only play around it so much. Your opponent still has to quest, still has to progress their board state, still has to gain lore. And if they play afraid of the Mulan shift, if they don't have the direct out to the shift target or whatever, you're just going to do other things in order to gain advantage, right? That's kind of the cat and mouse game. We saw that, and I talked about that a little bit in my last video, where like when you saw that turn 3 Tinkerbell come down and you were just like, I have to play around the big Tink shift because if I don't, then they can wipe my board. This is kind of the same concept. Now again, we've had more cards since set 1 obviously, and so it's easier to deal with those characters since then. But what this represents for both Ruby Amethyst and Ruby Sapphire is, I don't want to say a complete paradigm shift in what those decks do, but these cards occupy so much space because you do need to play the shift target and the obviously Floodborn character. It does take up a lot of space, and so you will see versions of these decks that experiment with this and ones that opt to not. But I do think that in potential matchups, this card can, like I've already explained, just absolutely dynamically shift the tempo, whether it is the threat of the shift, the actual shift coming down, or forcing your opponent to make some awkward plays in order to play around their board getting absolutely decimated by this card. I don't want to say it's an auto include in Ruby Amethyst and Sapphire Ruby, but it's definitely a card that can be considered because its impact is very, very strong. And yes, it is a weak card after the shift, but you play this for the immediate impact. Unless you have a way to use like the Vitalosphere or something like that item that gives Challenger plus Rush, which is the kind of the same issue we had with the Aladdin from set 1, where you only really wanted to play that if it had Rush with Pocket Watch. This card, you want to play it on Shift, or with Rush, you get the immediate impact. But that's kind of where this Mulan falls. Still a great card. The next card I want to take a look at is Sisu, Daring Visitor. This was a card that I also wrote off when I first looked at it. But when I thought about this some more, Ravensburger was actually giving me, and I'm sure what many other people were asking for, in more ways to remove low-cost characters without challenging, which, this card is great for. So it can help deal with the Cursed Merfolks and the Flynn Riders without challenging them, which, you absolutely want to do in Ruby to counter the Emerald decks that counter Ruby Amethyst, for example. And it also slots into Ruby Sapphire, potentially, right, as an alternative 3-drop to the Fishbone Quill if you don't see it, and also being able to deal with some of its tough matchups in aggro, as I was explaining earlier. What's actually potentially more interesting with this card, in my opinion, is in Amber Ruby, you can actually use something like the Queen to reduce someone's strength and then drop this and out that threat. And if you've ever seen like me or anybody else play with the Queen, you've probably seen how useful that card can be. It's actually really good. And so I think this card actually has application in all 3 decks. In Ruby Amethyst, it's probably the weakest because it's the least versatile. In Ruby Sapphire, you can ink it. In Amber Ruby, you can again use the Queen with it potentially. In Ruby Amethyst, it's kind of like either it drops and it does what it needs to do, or it's a dead card in your hand. That being said, though, there is still a lot of useful application for this, both early and mid to late game, because your opponent's going to be top decking their 1-drop stuff in the late game too, just like you might. And so this card can deal with like the 1-drop hooks and Rafikis. It can deal with the Hiram. I've already said it can deal with Cursed Merfolk and Flynn Rider. So there's a lot that this card could potentially do, which is interesting. And if we do get future strength modulation, this card just might even see more play. But between this card, Brawl, and Madame Medusa, you have a lot of non-challenging sources of removal to deal with the like low drop end of the curve of aggro decks, which is really good, really great. And then I think this is going to be the final card that I take a look at, as like again another card that's just an auto include in almost I don't want to say any Ruby deck, but I think Ruby Amethyst for sure, is Brawl. Inkable, but being able to deal with those 2 strength or less characters is just why I think it's a little bit better than Sisu. So when you take a look at Pinocchio, right, it's a body that exerts for 2 that is uninkable, right? And that's mainly the reason why it's been, not included sometimes in Ruby Amethyst. And so Sisu is kind of the same thing. It's like if it was inkable, it would be much better. This card, if it's not good, it's ink. And when it's good, it's probably going to be really good. We've seen how powerful Medusa is. Literally every card I'm reviewing, I'm like, oh, that strength is Medusa-able. Card instantly drops a lot in value. Medusa is such a relevant card. And so Brawl coming into play. Yes, it's not a character, whereas Medusa's a 4/4 body as well, which is really good. The thing with Pinocchio is that you need another character on board that can challenge and take out whatever you exert. If it's something that has like evasive, you won't be able to get around it. So like this card, for example, Brawl, deals with the Tinkerbell most helpful, whereas your Pinocchio would need an evasive character along with it in order to challenge that Tinkerbell when you play the Pinocchio. Plus, because you have to challenge it with another character, you're potentially trading out your other character in order to deal with what you exert. So while the Pinocchio comes down and exerts that character, you lose your other resource that's challenging what character Pinocchio exerted, and therefore you just lose some tempo, because what do you develop after that? Well, you have a Pinocchio, and you lose your other developed character. Your opponent loses their, bigger threat. Hopefully, that's why you want to play Pinocchio, is to out a bigger threat on the opponent's side and take that trade. But then you're left with an underwhelming Pinocchio on board. Whereas Brawl preserves what you've developed on board. Yes, you still use your tempo in order to play it, but it outs that character. Yes, it's more limited because obviously Pinocchio can exert huge things that you can take out with like a Maui, for example. But what Brawl does, and what you need it to do for like its relevant slot and taking out, let's say, like an Ursula, Deceiver of All, because that's mainly why Pinocchio went back into Ruby Amethyst decks, right? Is like we need a way to better deal with Ursula, Deceiver of All, because that card's singing is just way too strong. And I think this card is a better option. We'll wait and see. But yeah, just the inkability of it makes it really nice, because Ruby Amethyst draws a lot of cards, so you're likely not in top deck mode. And if you have this in hand, it's not a dead card like the Pinocchio sometimes is. All right, we're through the two biggest colors, in my opinion, for set 4, at least for the existing decks that I can see right now. But moving on to Sapphire, there are really only two cards that really caught my eye. The first one is Aerial Treasure Collector, which is a no-brainer in any Sapphire deck right now, because in matchups where you don't face items, so basically non-mirror match, this card on 6, or most likely earlier since you play ramp, will come down and quest for 5, which is huge. Not only that, it's a great lucky dime target. It might potentially displace the Bell, but this card being a 3/4 body with a ward gives it a significant advantage in the fact that it can get Medusa like Bell can. So you can actually drop this, leave it readied up. It likely doesn't get dealt with right away because you're playing it too early for your opponent to even have anything to deal with it, and then you're questing for 5. So this card is potentially huge for the deck. Uninkability, but again, Sapphire usually doesn't care about that, because what we're going to see in the next card is another way for you to scry for that Fishbone Quill. So even though Sapphire, in my opinion, doesn't get too much to complement the existing decks right now, these two cards in the Scuttle and the new Aerial Treasure Collector are massive for the Sapphire strategy as it's currently being played, in my opinion. I think both of these cards are an auto-include in both Sapphire Ruby and Sapphire Steel. How you're going to fit all this stuff into Sapphire Ruby, I don't know, because we just talked about how you can include a ton of cards from the Ruby side into it. The deck might just undergo a complete makeover, I don't know, or you'll see many different variations of the deck, and that's really great to see, actually, that diversification, which means you can't really prepare for one variant. You don't know what you're going to play. But these cards that increase consistency, I've already talked about this many times, are like the best cards you can play in any card game. It's not necessarily super great because it doesn't like just get you the card you need to your hand, a la Yu-Gi-Oh style, or MTG. But being able to scry 4 for an item is huge, right? It complements that Aerial, it complements the Hiram Draw engine, which is the main focal point of Sapphire. The only downside to this, which, if you've played Amber Steel Song with the Aerial Spectacular Singer, you can sometimes scry away some very important cards because the cards you put to the bottom, you're like, oh, like there go 2 of my flutes, there go 2 of my Hirams. So, that does happen, unfortunately, but being able to grab an item is still very beneficial, especially because this card costs 2. I've talked about this already. There's not really too many good 2-drops you want to play in Sapphire. This card is now an instant include in all those Sapphire builds, plus the fact that you're able to scry and hopefully pick up a Fishbone Quill if you don't have one already, and then play the Fishbone Quill next turn is just like the perfect curve out for you as a Sapphire player. Between the mulligan and this card, you're digging pretty deep to try to find that Fishbone Quill to set up your game plan, and these two cards, I think, do a lot for the existing decks. Now, the other Sapphire cards, I think they're kind of interesting. Maybe we'll see some new archetypes and new decks being played with them. I just don't think that too many of them fit into the existing Sapphire decks, which are basically just Sapphire Steel and Sapphire Ruby. But let me know in the comments if you think there are some other things we should be considering. Alright, to wrap up this video, we're going to take a look at what Steel cards I think can be used in existing decks in the Aerial Sonic Warrior. So yes, keep saying it every time this card comes up, it is a Medusa target, but at worst it's ink, and at best it's a card that, especially when you play it on shift, can start dealing some serious damage in certain matchups, because when you start singing songs, you're obviously not paying ink to use those songs, therefore you can then pay 2 ink to deal 3 other damage to another character. Again, on shift, this is just another way that you slow down those aggro decks. Being able to deal with evasives is also huge. That's one of the reasons why Steel is so versatile, because you don't need to challenge those evasives. You can just deal the direct damage to them. This card is just a really solid overall card. If it was a 4/8, it would probably be way too strong, to be honest. So it's actually pretty good that it's a 3/8, so that Medusa can keep it in check. Because again, if you're on the play especially and you shift this on 4, like the Medusa is still 2 turns away, so you're getting some value off of this card. Because again, you're paying your ink to shift it, so you're not going to be able to get the value off of the ability to pay 2, even if you sing a song that turn. But yeah, this card continues to be a very good card. Plus, it has one of the best enchanteds I've seen yet. Very nice artwork. So it'll probably be the Elsa of this set, the Cinderella from set 2, what was the main one from set 3? I guess it's the Ursula, but I think the Jafar is nicer, to be honest. Yeah, I think this enchanted, it's a princess enchanted, so it's going to be worth a lot regardless. Next up, I want to talk about LeFou. So I mentioned this a little bit already, but I think this card really is just an instant include in Amethyst Steel. It's a really big boost for that deck, I think, because again, Amethyst has some of the rush characters that can challenge right away, which means you drop a challenge character, you drop this for free in the same turn. That's a huge tempo gain for you. So again, another one of these cards that are able to swing the tempo of a match. Rush does that to a certain degree, but getting this card out on field as well is also a potential big deal. Plus the fact that I've already mentioned this as well, Captain Hook and Rafiki as your 1-drops, if you're able to challenge something and then drop this, on turn 2, that means on turn 3 you're singing your 3-cost song potentially, right? And there's a lot of good ones in Amethyst and Steel. So this does a lot for the aggro strategy of Amethyst Steel. It does a lot for that deck being able to claw back some tempo. It's a solid card overall. Does this make its way into Sapphire Steel or Amber Steel or anything like that? I don't think so. Amber Steel doesn't really challenge, right? They sing songs to remove characters. Sometimes they challenge, but usually not. Does this see play in Steel Emerald? I don't think so either, right? Because again, you're focused on a control game with this card, with that deck usually. So you're not really challenging too much. You want your opponent to challenge your characters, and then you out their characters with the Steel songs. So yeah, hard sell in those other decks, but I think this really finds a place in Steel Amethyst. And I personally think Steel Amethyst is a really unexplored color combination. I think it's potentially really, really good. I'm not sure why it just really hasn't panned out as a top deck yet, but I don't think this card necessarily does it for that deck, but it definitely helps. Getting that extra advantage potentially is really, really big. And then again, this is just any body you put on the board, for the Mim cards to just bounce back to is huge, because you can bounce this back and then Mim banish something else and then replay it again for free, right? It's just like free fodder for the bounce if you need it for that, right? Like there's a lot of unique things that you can do with this, which is really interesting. And then the last card I want to take a look at to wrap up this video is Fortisphere. So I kind of again talked about this in my last video, but this is an auto include in Sapphire Steel. This is just another 1-cost item that replaces itself, so again helping you scry, dig through your deck for the cards you need, and another item per hero, right? In certain scenarios, the bodyguard factor could come up. It only costs 1 to use. I mean, Popsicle is free to banish and heal, but in certain scenarios you can use this to keep certain things safe so that you can get that extra little bit of questing in or something, right? Like normally you don't quest with Cogsworth, maybe you do now because you can protect it with, I don't know, whatever. And it just helps you maintain like the Simba from set 3, the super rare that has 7 toughness, like bodyguarding with that and then questing with like your Beast Tragic Hero if you still play that, your cogs with, etc., that you normally wouldn't quest with, maybe, like that's seems pretty strong, right? That's like an extra 4 lore that you normally wouldn't maybe get if you're trying to draw with your beast and keep your cogs worked up for the resist. Just I'm just throwing stuff out there, but the main reason you play this is it's a 1-cost inkable item that's basically 8 popsicles in your deck now, and just increases the viability of Huron in Sapphire Steel. And honestly, Sapphire Steel needed more help, because they just get kind of run over by Ruby Sapphire when the other player is a good player. They know how to really play around the Steel cards, because again, like I mentioned, Ruby beats Sapphire. Ruby beats Steel. So just giving them more draws is really strong, because it allows them to potentially race a little bit better, dig for those lucky dimes in order to close out the games, because Sapphire Steel can also play those aerials and get those on board, and the other Sapphire Ruby player has to accelerate their removal, and really the only thing they can do is either challenge it once it's exerted or be prepared, right, to get it off the board, because they can't Medusa it. Yes, they can probably Tremaine it, but you're going to protect it playing around Tremaine most likely. So yeah, a lot of benefit with this card, making your Hiram draw engine all that much better. Maybe you don't even need to play Beast Tragic Hero now, because you can kind of go the Ruby Sapphire route where your only draw is basically the Hiram, but you have, in addition to like popsicles, you have this card as well, drawing you a card. A super strong card, just because of that. But yeah, that's going to wrap it up. Let me know in the comment section below if you think there's anything else that can make it into the existing decks in the format. Don't know if I'll have the time to kind of explore what new decks might be coming out or what new ink combinations might be coming out. Maybe, I'll find some time if Pixelborn updates or something. I can go on there and throw some decks together and test some stuff out, kind of like what I did prior to set 3 coming out. But again, let me know in the comment section below what you want to see. Thank you again for watching. If you made it this far, Quantum is out.